All right, today we're going to talk about why your ex is running away from you. And there's really a lot of reasons for why someone would run away from you after a breakup. Though, if you're going to put me in a corner and try to ask me to choose one core reason, I would say usually we see this type of behavior from exes because seeing you triggers their avoidant side. And really that's what I want to focus this video on. So in this video, you're going to learn about the avoidant nature of exes, exactly what goes through their mind when they see you and run away, the trigger points of an avoidant, and reliving trauma. So let's just jump right in. So for the past few months, I've really been diving into avoidant attachment styles on this YouTube channel. So it's definitely top of mind. And in my opinion, if you're encountering an ex who's running away from you, it's probably due to their avoidant side being triggered. So what exactly does that mean? Well, generally speaking, there are four main core attachment styles that we see people have in relationships. You have the secure attachment style, the anxious attachment style, the avoidant attachment style, and the fearful attachment style. Now, if you want an in-depth explanation on what each of those attachment styles is, I would recommend going to our website and checking out some of the articles that we've written on attachment styles there, because I do a breakdown of what each one looks like. But I want to really hyper focus on the avoidant attachment style because we're finding that the vast majority of our clients who are dealing with exes after a breakup are telling us that their exes have avoidant or fearful avoidant tendencies. So their exes tend to be dismissive avoidant or fearful avoidant. Now, you're usually considered as having an avoidant attachment style if you meet the following criteria. Number one, you're uncomfortable with intimacy. Number two, you don't really like putting labels on relationships. Number three, you won't share your feelings with your partner because you don't want to open up and allow yourself the opportunity to get hurt. And number four, you never let your partner get close enough to really see you become emotionally vulnerable. And the really interesting thing about the avoidant attachment style to me personally is that their entire existence is about balancing this paradox they exist in. They want love, but they won't let anyone close enough to give them that love. So how does this relate to them running away from you when they either see you unexpectedly or just running away from you in general? Well, believe it or not, simply being around you so soon after the breakup can actually cause their avoidant side to trigger. So the mere act of seeing you or talking to you an excessive amount can sometimes bring them back to that time in the relationship where they became overwhelmed by you, even if that overwhelm is making of their own design. Now, lately I've been garnering a lot of attention for a YouTube video that I talked about where I said, this is what happens when you stop chasing an avoidant. And I really make the case of why it's important for you to begin to go against maybe the internal programming that your brain is saying like, hey, you need to chase this person, you may lose them forever. I make the case this is not what you should be doing. You should be doing the opposite of that because not only will it allow you to grow as an individual without them, but it makes you more attractive to them in the long run. And that video that I did kind of went viral a little bit. And in that video, the thing that people resonated the most with was something I call the anxious and avoidant self-fulfilling cycle. All right, so how does that work? Well, think of it like this. There are 8 main stages that usually a relationship will go through if you're an avoidant. So as an avoidant, you first start out the beginning phase of a relationship wanting someone to love you. So they find you, they start dating you, and things are really great at first. But eventually, your need for open communication and intimacy triggers their avoidant side, and they begin to pull away. This is when they start basically considering leaving a relationship. Then they actually do leave the relationship and they're ecstatic about it. But that nostalgia eventually begins to kick in. They start to feel lonely. They start to feel like they need to find a distraction for the loss. And they enter the victim mentality and wonder why this is always happening to them. And basically they go through this cycle again and again and again and again. Now, the important thing to pay attention here is that everything starts to go downhill in this cycle right around the third stage. So what happens then? Well, basically you're pushing for the relationship to have more open communication or emotional intimacy, and it triggers their avoidance side. So when they first started noticing, like when the problems start to begin, is when you are doing something that triggers their avoidance side, and it's not usually anything you're doing on purpose. It is usually a very basic, simple ask of, I want to have more open communication or emotional intimacy. So what happens is you sense something's wrong when they're pulling away. So what do? Well, you basically try to do everything you can to fix the situation. And what literally happens then is you basically trigger their avoidance side and they avoid you even more. Now, we've literally seen this happen in so many situations in so many different ways that we're really confident in saying that when an ex is running away from you, in most scenarios, it's usually because of this phenomenon. Something is triggering their avoidant side. But what's actually going through their mind when they're running away from you? That's a good question. So there's any number of thoughts that can go through their head, but it's important to understand that, again, it's all being triggered by their avoidance side. But if you want to be specific, I think asking a dismissive avoidant is probably the best way to go. So I'm going to volunteer myself here because every single test that I've taken shows that I am a dismissive avoidant, even though I think I'm secure, but apparently I'm not. So anyways, there are typically three things that I personally think when my avoidance side gets triggered. The first one is, no more drama. I don't want any more drama. Number two is, I'm better by myself anyways. It's always been that way. And number three is, see, I knew I was right about them. So what I'd like to do is take a moment and kind of break down what each one really looks like.
Real quick, I want to say that if you're new to this YouTube channel or you're trying to figure out what you should be doing to get your ex back and you're trying to learn if you even have a chance in your specific circumstance, probably the smartest thing for you to do is actually stop by our website, www.exboyfriendrecovery.com, or take our Ex Recovery Chances quiz that can be found at exboyfriendrecovery.com. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, taking that free quiz is super easy to do. All you have to simply do is look in the description link below this YouTube video and click on the link you see there. It will take you directly to the quiz where you can fill it out and get an easy answer on what you should be doing going forward and overall what your chances look like in your specific situation. All right, so let's get you back to the video.
So let's talk about the sigh of relief, no more drama type thought. All right, so sometimes after an avoidant runs away from you, whether that's from seeing you in person or just in general, this is the thought that typically runs through our heads. No more drama. Thank goodness. And I think it's connected to a point that I'm about to make a little bit later, so I don't want to give too much away here, but generally it has to do with our preconceived notion that we have about you. So generally speaking, drama actions in relationships occur from highly anxious individuals, and it just so happens that the anxious and avoidant pairing is the most common we see in our coaching practice. So sometimes just getting away from the source of anxious behaviors, which we label as drama, is enough to warrant salvation for an avoidant. So again, let's look at that graphic that I talked about with regards to this self-fulfilling cycle. So basically what happens is stage 6 of that 8-stage process is relief. I'm so happy that I left. That's a definite thought that goes through our head when we're avoiding you. You get this initial relief of, okay, I don't have to have the drama there. The second main thought you're going to find avoidants have is, well, I'm better by myself anyways. So avoidant individuals are individualistic by nature. They like doing things themselves. And this actually harkens back to their childhood. So when you're looking at what shapes the avoidant attachment style, you always have to go to childhood-based trauma. So their primary caregivers gave them enough of the basic necessities needed to survive. So they gave them food, shelter, clothing, etc. But they weren't really great at providing emotional support. So as a result, from childhood, they had to learn to self-soothe and learn to be individualistic. And this is a practice that they carry all the way into adulthood. So after a breakup, they might literally think, well, you know what? I'm better by myself anyways. They have sort of the lone wolf mentality. And it's important to understand that it's a way to cope, to soothe themselves so they don't have to deal with the grief and trauma that's associated with the breakup. And ultimately in life, though, you need others. So a life lived alone is not really much of a life at all. And they will eventually come to that conclusion because if you look again at that self-fulfilling cycle, the reason it continues to self-fulfill, the reason is because they're going around in the circle and eventually they end up in the same place they started. They want someone to love them. They're just too afraid of letting someone close enough to provide that love for them. So the final main thought that you're going to find that avoidants have after a breakup is, see, I knew I was right about them. So throughout your time together, your ex 100% developed a lot of preconceived notions about you. So if you're overly anxious in the relationship, then that's the notion that gets stuck in their head. So running away from you usually means their avoidance side gets triggered and they get stuck in this thought loop. I knew I was right about them. They're always looking to go too fast, too soon. Why can't they just be normal? And this really reminds me of an article that I recently partnered with our very own Coach Anna with. All right, so this is going to really focus on the trauma of reliving the breakup. So a few days ago, Coach Anna and I partnered and wrote an article together, basically on closure letters. So we recorded a podcast, we filmed a video, we wrote an article together on the proper way to handle closure letters. Should you send them? Should you not send them? Basically make this gigantic argument for why we haven't seen it work for our clients. And what I found really interesting about the discussion, though, was Coach Anna brought up this really interesting points. So her word for word were, for adults, especially if there are unresolved past traumas and negative experiences, receiving apologies or accountability letters in the incorrect form with the incorrect timing has the effect of reliving an emotionally damaging experience. Now, she's talking about writing an apology within a letter, but I actually think it can extend into running to an ex, albeit on a much smaller scale. So let's say you're walking down the street, minding your own business post-breakup, and suddenly you run into your ex unexpectedly. You wave, not wanting to seem too awkward, but they do one of two things. They walk by you like you don't even exist, or they gracefully try to avoid you. Why? Well, one theory is that seeing them can give them some form of small post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think this is exceptionally more likely to happen if you aren't very far from a breakup. So I think timing is a really important thing to consider here. So generally speaking, the old adage of time healing all wounds rings true to a certain extent. But if your ex just broke up with you a few days ago and then suddenly sees you and runs away, it's more likely that their fight or flight response gets triggered and they're happy to hightail it out of there. Which leads me to my final point. That has to do with the avoidant trigger system. So my hypothesis throughout this entire video has been basically the following formula. If your ex runs away from you, basically that means their avoidant side is getting triggered. In other words, by studying how an avoidant operates, it'll give you some greater insight into understanding why they're pulling away from you, because at its core, an avoidant running away is just a form of pulling away. And therein lies my fascination. I totally butchered that language. And therein lies my fascination with what triggers them. So lately I've been playing with this idea of like avoidant exes having a trigger system. So a trigger system is basically different circumstances that trigger an ex's avoidance side. And we can apply this trigger system to two distinct points in relationships. So we can apply it to during the relationship phase and after the relationship phase. So let's take a look at during the relationship phase. So we're kind of stuck in this mindset a lot of times, I notice, where people assume that exes and breakups are kind of black and white. The reality is that there's a lot more situations that operate in this weird gray area where we're kind of like, I don't know. So for instance, I noticed when studying breakups that oftentimes when an ex who classified as an avoidant got triggered at different points throughout the relationships, meaning there's almost like a threshold behind what triggers their avoidant side. The one commonality we can find is usually the trigger points almost always have to do with taking a relationship to like a perceived next level. And usually that correlates with the loss of independence. So here are the triggers I've identified that usually happen during relationships. So getting asked out on a date, becoming official, talking about moving in together, actually moving in together, talking seriously about marriage, looking at rings together, getting engaged, getting married, having a child together. Usually what we're finding is the avoidant side gets triggered when they hit the threshold of any of these distinct triggers. But that's where it gets really interesting, because we can also apply the trigger system to after the relationship is finished. All right, so where really this differs from its counterpart has more to do with a perceived threat of another relationship forming as opposed to a direct assault on their independence. So basically, when you're looking at the transition points as you move up a value ladder, and if you're not familiar with what a value ladder is, I highly recommend that you read some of our articles or even purchase our program to learn about it. It's essential if you're interested in learning how to recover after a breakup. But basically, there are trigger points that happen as you move up or scale the value ladder, right? So what are the major trigger points? Well, okay, so sometimes getting back in touch after no contact can trigger an ex, and they'll become more avoidant. Keeping a conversation going too long, transitioning from texting to phone calls, transitioning to the dating phase, becoming too emotionally intimate on dates, and finally asking to be in a relationship again. These are all trigger points for an avoidant. Now look, what's the commonality there? Again, it's a loss of independence, but it's a threat of a new perceived relationship actually unfolding. But I want you to realize that just because an ex is running away at these tipping points doesn't necessarily mean you don't have a chance of having a healthy and happy relationship with them again. Usually it indicates to me that you're going too fast too soon, or you just need to give them more time.